This is Doleo, an original thriller fiction podcast presented in serialized format, a chapter at a time. Written by Jared Canton, narrated by Joshua Canton, a SteadyChaos production. Previously on Doleo. My neck was fully covered by the base of the mask and the opening of the mock, which overlapped each other just enough to layer securely. The mock was covered by a sleek, bulletproof vest, not bulky like those police wear over their uniforms. At my chest was the bulletproof plate that, combined with the vest, would allow me to take point-blank handgun rounds, but as Dad had said, nothing larger with any degree of certainty. The mock was long-sleeved, and from what Dad described, warm. It reached my wrists, ending where my gloves began. The gloves were knife-resistant, and a bit like the chainmail armor of the distant past, only lighter, more pliable. My pants were basic polyester and spandex hybrids with cargo pockets, fastened by a utility belt that, as of this moment, was free from attachments or tools. The pants ran long and met seamlessly with quarter boots that were black, light, flexible, and comfortable. I looked legitimate, which had been the best I dared hope for. More importantly, the outfit felt right, comfortable, relatively functional. I sequenced through a few blocks and strikes, and the uniform flowed with my body, hugged its actions. There's one more. Dad hesitantly handed me a heavy box. And I know what you're going to say, but if we're going to go through all this trouble not to lose you to prison, then I'm not going to lose you in another way. He cleared his throat and poorly concealed his face as a tear streaked his cheek. As I opened the box, he began, "It's a Glock 17 with suppressor and M3 light. I know how you feel about guns, and I hope you don't have to use it, but if you need it, I want you to have the option. I need you to have the option." I threaded the holster and gun into my tactical belt, and dragged it along the belt until it reached my right hip. I nodded, didn't say a word. If my dad, after what had happened to him, could buy a gun for me to protect myself, then I could certainly do him the favor of at least carrying it. "You come up with a name yet?" It was the last step in this becoming real, for both of us. For this to work, people need to know about this persona, this vigilante, about you. He looked at the masked man before him. I saw no less pride in his face today than I had the day I graduated from law school. Yeah. There was a hesitation that I couldn't really explain, and it blocked the word behind my lips. I knew he'd understand, but I didn't want to send the wrong message, even if for only a minute before I could explain. "Doleo," I revealed. "You think that's a good idea, son? Ross digs deep enough, he'll find some ties between Ryder Daniels and that name. I'm sure it needs to mean something to me. And what does that name mean to you?" It was a testy response, contaminated with jealousy. If I didn't have CIPA, that would have been my last name. That would have been my family. Dad nodded. He looked hurt. Hurt that I had chosen a name that didn't include him, that lent preference to the family that had abandoned me, as he never would. "But how's it fit?" he asked, the hurt look replaced by the confusion in his voice. This was where he'd see. It meant more, much more. When I created the story of this vigilante, I told Ross he had shouted Aquitus at me. It's Latin for justice. Doleo is Latin too. It means to suffer, feel pain. Ironic, Dad said. Exactly. I may not be able to feel pain, but maybe I can serve some up. Episode 17, Doleo. The wind howled between the mortar and brick buildings scattered throughout this part of town. I couldn't feel it, every inch of my skin protected by the black fabric that was supposed to turn Ryder Daniels into Doleo. This wasn't my town. This wasn't a place Ryder Daniels would take a leisurely stroll down a dark alley. This was blood struggle territory. It hadn't taken long to track down the two gangsters that had shot and killed Luttrell's brother. Jermaine Fields and Rodney Rhodes were not first-time offenders. On top of that, they weren't even first-time violent offenders. Jermaine had been implicated and charged in 7 violent crimes, most stemming from gang-related altercations in the greater Boston area. Rodney had only been charged in 1 crime, an assault and battery case that had taken place outside of Mass Medical, the very same hospital I had visited after the courtroom shooting. The fewer offenses probably indicated Rodney was either new, a higher-ranking official that stayed clear of the dirty work, or just a hell of a lot smarter than Jermaine. It was probably a combination of the latter too. Jermaine and Rodney both lived near H Block, showing official residences in a mid-sized brick apartment complex just east of town center. It had been 3 days since Dad had demonstrated the Doleo equipment in his room, and between that time and now, I had made several additions to my arsenal. The first addition was for parking and storage, one spot at the very same garage the police had panned through exhaustively just weeks ago. The very same garage from which the perp had fallen, just blocks from my residence. I reserved the spot under a fake name. Coupled with this spot, Dad had also purchased a second spot, 10 blocks from my condo, also unassigned. If one location was compromised, it was important that we had a backup. For storage, and an amateur vigilante lair of sorts, we had prepaid a year's lease on a small private basement apartment near the second parking garage. It would be used to keep my arsenal, equipment, and any lingering evidence safe from Ross's prying eyes. I hadn't owned a car since I had moved to Boston. Living in the belly of the beast, public transportation had, to this point, provided all the mobility I needed. I could get to work, to the gym, entertainment, combat instruction, all by my own 2 legs, the T or the commuter rail. Now, however, I needed to get around the city fast, through traffic, and undetected. There was only one practical option, and I paid $17,000 for it, used. Again, cash. It was a Ducati Monster S4R3, 1000cc, motorcycle, jet black. I had owned a motorcycle in college, and my dad had eventually talked me out of it. Now, he saw the necessity, and put aside his general distaste for the machines. The Ducati S4R3 was one of the fastest street-legal bikes in the United States. It boasted 130 horsepower on a frame of only 390 pounds, an absolute rocket of unnecessary proportions. The man I purchased it from, selling it at his wife's stern suggestion, stated he had brought it past 150 miles per hour on the Mass Pike. The owner's manual confirmed it could reach such speeds, which would be far more than enough to elude any machine on the congested, angular streets of downtown Boston. The final addition to my arsenal was a weapon, and was the hardest decision to make. During the decade plus that I had trained under Grubbs, I became proficient with a litany of weapons. From blades to bats and bottles, I was comfortable weaponizing the world around me, but more traditional weapons had certain gravitas I couldn't resist. The 2 weapons that had intrigued me most were whip chains and crescent blades. Crescent blades were unique in that they proved very useful for both defending weapon attacks and for attacking. That being said, they weren't a particularly useful option for non-lethal force scenarios. The whip chain, however, was as appealing to the observer as it was versatile and effective at range. I had practiced over the years, primarily with a 5-foot antique whip chain that I had uncovered in Grubb's dingy basement closet. The weapon looked exactly as its name would indicate. It's essentially a whip, consisting of chain links, normally between 7 and 12, with a weighted dart on the end. The weapon is popular because of the observable speed with which it can be spun, launched, pulled, and directed. As a child, I had fastened colorful ribbons to the end to catch Dad's eye when I practiced. As the red ribbon traversed over my head, then around like a lasso, Dad would applaud. I culminate my act by launching the dart in the lethal attack of a wall, or tree, or other harmless inanimate object. It wasn't a weapon that I ever expected to have strapped at my side for intended use on city streets. The ribbon on the end of a practice whip chain is multi-purposed. First, it brings the tricks more clearly to the eye of the viewer. Secondly, it helps the training combatant predict the movements of the dart or practice weight, because the dart can be deadly sharp, and even a practice weight, with appropriate momentum, can turn dangerous on its operator. I learned this firsthand as a teenager, earning a 7-inch bruise on my lower back thanks to a vengeful practice weight. Of course, I had continued the routine as if nothing had happened, barely even noticing the weight's impact with my back. Dad, however, had noticed, and when he observed the bruise, he advised that I should focus on more easily controlled weapons. Had I been using a dart and not the practice weight, I could have easily dumped a good portion of my internal organs onto the mat. That had been the end of my run with a whip chain, until now. Its value in keeping attackers at a distance, in disarming and restraining potential combatants was too valuable to pass up. It was also a weapon of shock and awe, and I needed people to tell stories about Doleo. I needed the notoriety to prove his existence. But now, crouching on a rooftop shrouded in darkness, I mentally prepared for my moment of no return, a Glock of last resort fastened at my right hip, and a whip chain rolled neatly at my left. Flashing stars and planes dotted the night sky, interrupted only by random steamy clouds that drifted across a near full moon that cast a detailed shadow of Doleo on the concrete. The shadow looked more like a reflection, black and crisp, than a mere void of light. I moved to the edge of the roof, the moon at my back, the Doleo shadow leading the way like a dark arrow at my feet, encouraging a path of ill intent. I descended the rickety fire escape to the nearest third-floor window, the floor that Germain lived on. The mesh steel writhed under my weight, its joints ached aloud, and I stopped, steadying the steel long enough for silence to creep back into the night. A gunshot echoed and sirens cascaded from the street below, maybe a half-mile away. From my perch, I could see the faint blues and reds rise in the horizon, stealing the blackness from the urban night sky. A typical night in a part of the city government, police, and the legal system had seemingly forgotten. The fire escape window into the hallway was framed white, flaking loose paint from years of wear and neglect. An afterthought, disregard had suppressed the people within this part of town, and those that had risen to power in the absence of true, decent leadership had further deadened the spirit of the residents within buildings like these. The window jarred back and forth in its tracks as I slid it open. It was light, cheap, old, and probably poorly sealed the cold air from bringing its chill inside. Even in the hallway now, I could see spatters of my own steamy breath leaking from the small breathing holes in my mask. There were 4 doors in the hallway, 4 different apartments. Apartment 303 belonged to Germain, and based on his file, 1 other occupant. The hall was silent, only 1 egress point, a staircase plainly visible at the corridor's far end, nearest apartment 301. Germain's door was cracked slightly, which I found surprising at this time of night. Maybe he was expecting company. A sweet aroma, like cigar smoke laced with pine, snaked through the cracked door, followed by the sound of a choking cough, and then 2 distinct laughs, then a third. All men. The smoke was clearly weed, and if the door was open, the community was likely friendly, meaning there were probably more blood struggles in the building, if not exclusively members. I knew for certain that Rodney was a member, and that he lived on the 2nd floor. There were likely more, which meant I needed to keep my presence stealthy, or mission number 1 would be my first and last. I pushed the door open far enough to slide through sideways. My quarter boots, now flat, filed down like the bottoms of my dress shoes, hit the kitchen linoleum without a sound. It was dull and old, and the room was just bright enough to see cheap flooring flex upwards at its corners from water damage or wear. The microwave door was open, and yellow light filtered out, illuminating a small plastic bag on the counter. It was filled with clumped greens that I recognized immediately from my younger days, the clear source of the piney aroma in the room. The microwave was the only active light source in the kitchen. The remaining light emanated from around the half wall between the kitchen and living room, where, out of view, I could hear the voices of the 3 men. They spoke like young men in a pack often do, uniformly, with an overwhelming blend of bravado and vulgarity. My legs crossed as they carried me sideways across the kitchen floor to the half wall. I reached my right hand down to the Glock, but it didn't feel right, and my hand retreated to support me at the wall as I peered into the living room. 2 black men and a white man filled the couch and 1 armchair. Two were jabbing feverishly at what appeared to be a video game controller, as the third placed a heavy glass vase to his face. He flicked the lighter on. It was clearly no vase. He breathed deeply, and the thick smoke that had filled the shaft of the glass pipe cleared, and he exhaled with a hard cough. He doubled over. His friends crackled feverishly, stopping their game momentarily to point and laugh. "Shit, Jermaine, you only get one pair of lungs, man," the white guy said, inadvertently identifying his friend for my benefit. The TV shifted colors, from darks to whites and yellows, and the room lit up like Fenway before a night game. A barcode tattoo on the white kid's neck illuminated. He had at least 3 lines, etched close to one another, vertically, as if I could slide him through the manual checkout aisle at a Stop and Shop. Jermaine stood, hacked hard twice, stopped, and then started my way. I ducked back tightly to the wall and waited. A knot hurtled up my throat, a tightly wound ball of anxiety, and then backed down as I forced a swallow. A tingling sensation ascended the notches of my spine as if it were a staircase. I held my breath, lungs full, light-headed, almost dreamlike, as if my body wouldn't respond when I needed it most. This was the moment, and all I felt was fear. The very second I needed focus and readiness, the bravery and power to force change, and I just wanted to be home, safe, in familiar surroundings. Then I thought of Dad and Cindy, and all of the victims I cared for that had faced down the cause of that suffering, with more pain as their only reward. I remembered those that had lost everything, everyone, only to see a plea bargain of 7 years as their sole retribution. This wasn't just about covering my ass anymore, nor about legitimizing lies. This was an opportunity to matter. This was about becoming something that was certain, effective, absolute. I was no longer a bystander, or cog in a broken system. I was a man with a curse turned gift. Instead of telling young people like Cindy to stand up, I had the opportunity to assume that burden for myself. It was my time to act, not just ask someone else to. No more shifting of unspeakable burdens. Jermaine was large, taller than I, and significantly wider. As he walked past my crouched position, he made no act acknowledging my presence. He reached for the fridge. The large metal door folded back, and he bent at the waist to peer into its glowing interior. "You bitches need anything?" He glanced over his shoulder to project his voice into the other room. It was then that he froze. His eyebrows bowed in disbelief, and his eyes darted to the floor. "Yeah!" The two of them from the other room chimed in unison. Jermaine's right hand rested atop the fridge door, propping it open. His left hand retreated slowly from the interior of the refrigerator down towards his stomach. His eyes remained steadily trained to the floor. "Don't," I growled in a whisper. I hesitated, and then placed my hand within range of my holstered Glock. With a single stride, I closed tightly on Jermaine's position. He turned his head a few degrees and peered in my direction from the corner of his right eye. I leaned in, inches from his ear. "Tell your boys you're stepping out." I had thoroughly planned getting to this point. My persona, weapons, Kinsley, Dad's role, and I now realized I had put an inadequate amount of thought into what the fuck I'd do once I got here. "Yo guys, I'm gonna grab some beers from next door." "Cool," one of the two from inside said dismissively. His statement supported my assumption that the building was infested with blood struggles, not just Rodney and Jermaine. Jermaine took a stride towards the door, arms held at his side in surrender. It was an act, because he then whirled around hard and shoved me back against the refrigerator. It tilted and crashed firmly into the wall before teetering forward. With an elbow, I swiftly assuaged the large appliance into stillness. I heard the men from the living room erupt into action. Their urgent movements sent shockwaves of noise in my direction. I ducked a looping right from Jermaine and delivered an abbreviated side kick to the exterior of his left knee, just enough to immobilize him. His leg buckled inward, awkwardly, and then he crumpled to the floor with a bellowing scream, laced with agony and surprise. The white man arrived in the kitchen first. The bong the group had been tending to earlier was still in his hand. His face twisted, overcome with anxious energy. He swung the glass paraphernalia in my direction like a club, panic overcoming thought, or planning, or precision. I ducked and he missed by a wide margin, so wide in fact that his momentum carried him past my position multiple strides, and he careened off the refrigerator. I grasped the freezer handle, opened it hard once, and the steel shattered his nose, sending him staggering back into the half wall. I repeated the action, again, then again, until the dented door escaped its hinges, now free in my hand. His lifeless body layered the wall and began a slow slide to rest. The second man, a black man, arrived shortly thereafter, a lamp in his hand, and he overhand chopped it down upon me. I sheltered myself with the freezer door, and the resulting collision sent a porcelain explosion into the air. As the white man, face bloodied, mangled and crushed from the stainless steel of the freezer, finished his descent to the floor, I reached out and disarmed him, now grasping the bong stem. I spun and backhanded the black man with it. The base ruptured against the man's shoulder. He shrieked and staggered back, shook his head, regained his balance, and charged again. I dropped to the floor, the bong stem remnants in my right hand, and jammed it forward with a violent pushing action. The glass tube burrowed itself into the charging man's thigh. Wide-eyed, he persisted, swinging wildly in my direction, lefts and rights, which I easily avoided in retreat. He paused, pulled a deep breath, fear and exhaustion apparent in his eyes. "What do you want?" he growled through fragmented breaths. "Nothing from you." I feinted at his wounded leg and threw a right hand. Mindful of my body position, the physical principles of torque, and lashed out like a tightly coiled snake. The man went down, hard. He didn't move again. "Jermaine!" I called as he fled into the hallway. I managed to close on him short of the fire escape as he attempted to limp out the window I had originally entered. I stalked him on the rickety steel. It creaked even louder now under double occupancy. "There's nowhere to go," I said. He limped on, upward, one slow stare at a time, his bad leg dragging behind him, like an inconvenient obligation he couldn't shake free of. I closed within feet, grew careless, overconfident, and it cost me. I should have seen it coming. I needed to be better. As Dad has said, this venture mandates that we stay 2 steps ahead, not sometimes, but always. I had lost focus. Jermaine kicked back unpredictably, swiftly, a vicious mule kick that impacted my thigh and spun me to a knee. He lurched hard, his limp now less pronounced, the final steps for the roof as I recovered to follow. He was larger, but much slower, and physically impaired, and I closed on him easily. His right hand disappeared in front of him, and then he swung it back, a glimmering flash in the night, moonlight on steel. His arm wavered inaccurately as he lumbered, but he didn't fire. He conquered the final stair and jumped to the roof as I landed just 3 feet behind him. Same roof, same spot, dropped a hard blow to his upper right arm, and iron clanked off crushed stone. He kept moving. I stayed behind, just steps, until he ran out of real estate. A familiar scene developed as he reached the building's edge. I cornered him. He stood, heels to a rooftop edge that led 4 stories down to the street. An adjacent building, a mere 12 feet to his right, tempted him to try a jump he couldn't possibly dream of making. He stared with an urgent fury I had only witnessed twice, the way Paul had looked at Grant, and the way Brett had looked at me. "Jermaine Fields?" I asked. "Yo, who's asking, freak?" I had come full circle. A freak of circumstance as a child, now a freak of choice as an adult. The word freak dissipated and evaporated into the vastness of the night sky. Doleo. I unraveled the whip chain from my hip, grasped it by the handle, and it slinked to the ground like a spool of chain dumped upon itself. Where's Rodney Rhodes? "Fuck, man, not here." "I know he lives here." "Man, he ain't lived here for 2 years. Check your facts, freak." A twinge of anger poisoned my mind, made me consider things I wasn't proud of. "Where is he?" "Uptown with the bigwigs, got promoted." I reached forward, grabbed Jermaine's shoulder and spun it, pulling his collar down. He tried to rip free, but my gloved index finger dug into where the new tattoo should have been fresh. Raw. He cried in pain. Staggered a bit at the ledge and windmilled his arms to regain his footing. A new, fearful look gripped his eyes, less obstinate. New tattoo? It was not a question. I may not have ever known pain, but I knew others' pain response. Luttrell had been telling the truth. He glared at me, a mixture of fear and anger. Fear at what I knew, anger at his helplessness. "Luttrell, that snitchin' bitch!" he barked. "Wrong. He wouldn't talk," I lied. "But I do know things you've done, things that deserve retribution. Who shot Luttrell's brother, you or Rodney?" "Yo, man, I was just along for the ride. Dropped some lead into him for fun. To get my mark, nothing personal. That chump was Rodney's hit." He smiled, a sick grin, completely absent regret. "Murder is always personal for someone." "Yo, it will be," he scoffed slyly. "You're in no position to be making threats. When my boys hear about this, we'll skull-fuck that mask off your face, then do the same to every person you've spoken to in the last 3 years. The smirk spread, now smeared across his face. Boiling hot anger freed me of restrictive conscience. Ryder became a foggy alternate reality. A tenseness overtook my body. I tried to relax, to think rationally. What do I do now? If anything, I had placed a target on Luttrell. This was the toughest part of the vigilante business. The risk, the danger, those are dire consequences only truly realized by a dead vigilante. But choice, without prisons and courts, of what to do with another life, that is the dilemma I hadn't adequately prepared for. I had long believed that all creatures are gifted one valuable life, and that one should take any and all strides to avoid wasting it. It would be hypocritical to approach others' lives, even murderous criminals, as simply recyclable. An organism is only as good as its genetic mapping in combination with the conditions of the petri dish in which it grew. Despite the struggles I endured as a child, I found my way into a loving, supportive variety of dish. Undoubtedly, Jermaine had enjoyed far less support from his environment, and he had found his acceptance elsewhere. With people like the Blood Struggles as your host, a life of crime seemed inevitable for the large, slow-looking man in front of me. Knowing it was an insufficient half measure, but much in line with my inherent hesitation to kill, I decided for now, harsh words and fear-inducing reprimands would have to suffice. Jermaine could in fact prove a valuable tool, spreading word of the existence of Doleo. I could use him to validate my story, keep Ross at bay. He would be worth more to the mission, alive. Then again, this was not a predictable world I had thrust myself into. External conditions often prevail over internal preference, and he forced an altogether different reality upon me. At some point during my indecisive procrastination, I had taken my eye off the ball for a second time. Jermaine reared back with a wide-arching swing and burrowed a knife blade deep into my deltoid. When he retracted his arm, the knife remained, perched in my flesh like a flag on newly claimed territory. Twice in my life, my body had warned of invisible attacks before they could strike. Apparently my powers had taken the night off. I tabled the why for another time. When I didn't flinch, Jermaine's face pulled long in awe. He staggered back along the roof's edge, staring with horror and confusion. He blinked hard, as if he could simply wash away the image before him. I glanced at my shoulder calmly, then back his way. The absence of pain did not mitigate fury, did not lessen it at all. It was a rage I needed to pacify compassion, to empower action with the brutality my new position would apparently mandate. "What the fuck are you?" he exclaimed in horror. He reached behind his back at his waistband, possibly for yet another weapon, and I reacted. With a narrow diameter 360-degree swing, I activated the whip chain. The heavy blade rotated twice, gained speed, and I thrust it forward. Like a drill through soft timber, it ripped into his left shoulder and buried itself dart deep north and east of his heart. I pulled the slack on the chain taut, and he tipped forward at a gentle angle onto his toes. His left arm swung to his front, another sidearm, this one a revolver, dull, small, short-barreled, a third potentially fatal oversight on my part. He lifted the revolver slightly, but the dart apparently sent pain waves through his body, evidenced by an audible yelp that nullified his efforts. His arm fell. He tried again to raise the arm, to no avail. I calmly pulled a tarot card from my cargo pocket with my free hand. It was the Justice card, an image of a scale, teetering to balance on its front. I slipped it into his jacket pocket, tapped it shut, and glared at his face. He looked accepting, no longer angry or obstinate, but fearful, bulged eyes, quivering lips, as if his fate were inevitable. "Tell your friends you met me." I leaned in to retrieve the dart to free him, a vigilante catch and release of sorts. Before I could, he saw an opportunity, lifted his left arm feebly and fired a singular wild shot past my ear. The clack ripped through the night, and my ear filled with a deafening, high-pitched scream. I reacted to a burst of overwhelming adrenaline, leaned back and punched him hard in the chest. The gun did not drop. He teetered back at the end of the taut whip chain, and his arm rose again. He fired another shot that carved into the concrete rooftop wide of my position. I yanked the chain, sending him hurtling frontward, and I planted a brutal front kick to his chest. He coughed hard and his arms flew forward violently, simultaneously as his torso lurched back. I yanked the whip chain, hard. It extracted from his shoulder and ripped open a gaping wound in its wake. His revolver clattered off the rooftop and skittered several feet away. Jermaine's eyes widened, appearing to finally grasp the reality of what was to come. He plunged backwards towards the roof's edge, his arms whirling wildly, helplessly, aimlessly. I momentarily regained sanity, or my humanity, and swung an arm out towards the flailing man. Time slowed, almost paused. My arm swung short of his, and I staggered to a knee, dropping both hands to the concrete rooftop. The crunch of steel, shattering glass ripped into the night as Jermaine landed. The horrendous result culminated with a blaring car alarm. The entire altercation atop the roof had taken only several dozen seconds, but my life would never be the same. I was now a man of two lives. A simmering and then more urgent commotion erupted below. Lights flashed on, flooding the street with their glow. I heard screams of direction, instruction from inside the apartment complex. I shook free of the temporary trance, sprinted left, and thrust the whip chain overhead as I jumped. It fired forward, and the 8 feet I leapt outward, supplemented by the length of the chain, proved adequate. The dart wrapped tightly around the fire escape railing of the adjacent building. The chain tightened, and I swung hard, crashing awkwardly into a brick exterior wall. I tumbled a flight of the fire escape stairs, and the feeble steel landing quaked and rattled violently until I came to rest. The chain unwound from the railing above and slithered through the grated flooring, piling upon itself at my side. I watched, weak, panting, as miraculously for this part of town, police cruisers, blues activated, pulled up to Jermaine's body within moments. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed Doleo, please come back for future episodes arriving at regular intervals, and subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast application.